Hello, welcome back to another episode of Rappin with the Rep. I'm State Representative Ken Gordon, representing Burlington, Bedford, and Precinct 3 in Wilmington. And I'm thrilled today to have as our guest on Rappin with the Rep, fellow representative and chair of the Joint Committee on Education, House Chair on the Joint Committee of Education, Alice Peisch from Wellesley. Thank you very much for coming on to the show.
Well, thank you very much for having me.
Education is one of the most important issues that face our residents in this district. It's what they talked about, one of the top topics when I was running for this seat, talking to people, and since I've been here. From a personal perspective, I moved to this district more than 20 years ago, purchasing the first and only house I ever bought, because education is such a great feature of this district and the schools are so strong. And I knew that at the time I had no children, but I knew that if I did, they would be there for them. And even if I didn't, I knew that if there was any downturn in the economy, my real estate, my house would hold its value because I could always sell to someone with school-age children. Businesses find it so important too, because when I talk to them, they don't talk about expenses here and there. What they say is, we want to come to Massachusetts and these districts in Massachusetts because you have the educated workforce and you have the infrastructure that we're looking for. So I appreciate your work on education. My first question deals with standardized types of testing. Now, I hear from parents and I hear from teachers and the superintendents that they're concerned about what they'll call teaching to a test, or the standards that are put in place that are blanket requirements of all districts. And our districts, in Wellesley, where you live, these are the premier districts in the state and in the nation, and they want to stay that way. How can we accomplish our goals of being unique while at the same time accomplishing the goals that the standardized testing calls for?
Well, I think you raise a very important question, and certainly one that I hear all the time, both from people in my district, which includes not only Wellesley but Weston and a part of Wayland, but also across the Commonwealth. And I think it's important to recognize that what Massachusetts has done and will be continuing to do is to set a certain bar in terms of standards that all students are required to meet, but leave it to the districts to determine how to implement and deliver the education. So, for example, Massachusetts, by and large, does not set curriculum. The Board of Education promulgates regulations and establishes what are called standards and frameworks that give guidance and direction to school districts as to what the students need to learn in order to pass the what are now the MCAS tests in math, English, language arts, and science, but leaves it to the districts to determine the sequence in which they're going to offer courses, the content of those courses. So I think if you look at the way Massachusetts has performed over the course of the 20 years that education reform has been a fact of life here, the Act passed in 1993. The first graduating class that was required to take the MCAS exams was in 2003. More recently, and over the course of the past 20 years, what we've seen in Massachusetts is tremendous improvement in the student performance, not just on the MCAS tests, which actually test at 8th grade level for the most part, even though they're given in the 10th grade. But on tests that are given nationwide and internationally, Massachusetts has ranked in many instances first, not just in the country, but in the top tier internationally. So I think that, and on those tests, frankly, it is the scores of the students in the districts that you're referencing that are responsible for our strong performance nationally and internationally. So while I understand the concern, I think if people keep in mind that they can tailor their offerings to the needs of their particular district, that the standards and the tests is just a sort of bottom line bar that we want to make sure all of our students cross, then I think all of the different varying needs of the different districts are met. And you touched upon what is one of the most important reasons for having these statewide standards, which is the need to have an educated workforce. We no longer, unfortunately, have significant employment opportunities for students that don't graduate from high school, or graduate from high school with a degree that is, unfortunately, not worth much.
Thank you for that. We're entering a new program called PARC, and the Partnership for Assessment of Readiness and College Careers. Can you tell me how that will play out, what the differences between that and the MCAS?
Certainly. The state, Massachusetts is one of, I believe, either 47 or 48 states that has adopted what's called the Common Core, which is a set of national standards that are actually quite high relative to the standards that are currently in place in most states. Massachusetts is considered to have very high standards to begin with. So the Massachusetts Board of Education, when adopting the Common Core, indicated to the extent that the Common Core standards were equal to or higher than the standards we currently have, we would use them. But to the extent there may be any areas in which the standards, the Common Core standards, might be lower than Massachusetts' current standards, we will stick with what is currently the standard in Massachusetts. The PARC Consortium is developing the assessment that will test how the students are doing once the Common Core is implemented. This is causing some concern, which is not to be surprised whenever there's a change. We're going to be moving from the MCAS tests, where, frankly, whether the Common Core existed or not, the state would probably be looking at transitioning to a different assessment, because over the course of the past several years, our students have improved to such a degree on the MCAS assessment that we need to bring in a test that is a little bit stronger. So we would be doing this regardless of the Common Core. But in terms of how it's playing out, I did bring some information with me with respect to that, because I think people are a little bit concerned about it. In the spring of 2015, I believe, will be the first time that the test is administered. Next spring in 2014, I think there are going to be a few pilot administrations of it, but the pilot administration will help the department ascertain whether or not the test needs to be refined a little more before it's finally given a year and a half out. And even in 2015, I think there's going to be some administration of both the MCAS and the PARC as we transition to completely having the PARC assessment. So while I fully appreciate that a lot of districts are feeling that they're being asked to do an awful lot in a relatively short period of time, because it's not only transitioning to the Common Core standards and the new assessment, but also we're in a period right now where all schools they've either implemented last year or will be implementing this coming academic year a new teacher evaluation system. There's also a requirement that all teachers be trained in, take some training with respect to English language learners. And I know that this is feeling to the field like I've often heard the term used that they're building a plane while flying it. And I think that the Board of Education, which is responsible, the Department of Education, which is governed by the Board of Education and is responsible for the implementation, is conscious of this, and I think my understanding is willing to be flexible with respect to how this all gets rolled out.
Well, that's good to hear, because I know from the point of view of the teachers that have talked to me, there's a lot of work that's being expected of them in these new evaluations. I've heard that they've got to fill out forms that, if on paper, are inches thick. Have you heard these reports as well?
Again, I think that whenever you implement a new system, there's some apprehension about how it will work. And certainly the first year of implementing the new evaluation system is undoubtedly a significant amount of work for all concerned, because every teacher and administrator will have to be evaluated in a way that for many districts, not all, but many, will be completely different from what they're used to. Some districts have had this kind of an evaluation process in place for some time so that it won't be quite as onerous for them. But one thing to keep in mind is that after the first year, if memory serves me correctly, the system goes on to sort of a staggered basis, so that those teachers that really need a fair amount of support will be able to get it, and those that are relatively well-performing can continue on in doing the work that they've been doing without having to go through the same identical process each and every year.
Yeah, I think everyone would agree that we want our teachers to all perform to the best that they can and to be trained if there's any training that's needed.
Absolutely.
No, are these standards implemented for all grades, or are tests given to some grades? How does that work?
So are we talking about the teacher evaluation or the PARC assessment?
We're talking about the Common Cause.
The Common Core.
Common Core, I'm sorry.
So it has not yet been rolled out, so I can't answer that question specifically, but I believe it's a K-12 program, so I assume that there will be some need to make some adaptations throughout the system.
Okay, and how about the PARC assessments? Is that a test that's given to children?
I believe that the PARC assessment will replace the MCAS tests, and as I'm sure you know, the MCAS tests are given, I believe, starting in the 3rd grade through the 10th grade. And virtually, it's changed over the years, but I think it started as being administered in the 4th grade, the 8th grade, and the 10th grade, and over time, tests have been added, and I believe it's virtually every grade between 3 and 10 now has an MCAS test, and I'm assuming that the PARC assessment will be similar to that, although it has not yet been rolled out, so I couldn't say for sure.
Okay. Let's change the topic a little bit and talk about money, everyone's favorite topic on Beacon Hill.
Right.
Chapter 70 is the chapter that supports education and state funding of the local needs of schools, along with their local fundraising.
Property taxes, yes.
Property taxes. I'm proud to see that this year the legislature has increased funding under Chapter 70 to most municipalities. What have you seen, and congratulations for your oversight of that. What's your reaction to what's happened this year on the budget?
I think that the legislature, along with the governor, has shown over the past several years, and actually I think surprisingly, since 1993, when the Chapter 70 formula that we now operate under was created, the state has met its commitment to a significant investment in public education across the Commonwealth. And I think it's been particularly noteworthy that over the course of the past few years, when the revenues to the Commonwealth declined dramatically after the 2008 financial disaster, we nonetheless have maintained our commitment to Chapter 70. Having said that, I think that while it's certainly all districts love to get money from the state, I think we're moving to a place where we need to consider whether or not further increases are related to how the money is used. Currently, Chapter 70, it's a formula-based number. Every district gets a different per pupil amount depending upon both the needs of the district and the capacity of the district to fund the school, the needs on their own. But we basically give each district a check for the total amount and let them spend it as they like. As we increase the funding and we see that some districts with the same amount of money and the same student bodies produce different results, I think there's an increasing desire to target specific programs and increases in funding aligned with programs that work. So I'm working on that, and I think over the course of the next few years you'll see some movement in the direction of we'll give you more money, probably in the way of grants over and above the Chapter 70 amounts, but they'll only be available for districts that are committing to doing things like, for example, an extended school day in an underperforming district, meeting certain criteria. Extending the day alone and paying for it doesn't necessarily improve performance unless you do the right things with that extra time.
Right. And was that related to a bill that was introduced by Representative Jason Lewis from Stoneham there, an adequacy study? Or is that somewhat different?
That is somewhat different. Jason Lewis and I co-sponsored a bill this session. I'm not sure whether that will get out of committee or not, but the adequacy study concept is something that's been around for a while, and it was tested in the court case what's known as the Hancock case several years ago, where the SJC ruled that the Commonwealth has made great strides in improving education, and that funding alone, or increased funding alone, doesn't necessarily result in improved performance. And so did not find in favor of the plaintiffs who were arguing that some districts were continuing to be underfunded. I think the real question is how we can most efficiently use the funding that we have available, and to the extent we can identify districts that don't have sufficient funding to deliver what needs to be delivered in terms of improving student performance, we should do it. The formula, the Chapter 70 formula, was developed in 1993, and it used that formula was based on a lot of estimates, because no one had ever done this before. And with 20 years of experience now, there's no question that some of the elements of that formula, the estimates were not correct. The one that's pointed to the most is the figure for special education, which assumes, I think, something like 3% of the students would be in special education. We know that that is grossly understated, and it's closer to, I think, 17% statewide, and with some variations by district. So I think that there's definitely a need to look at the formula and determine whether or not the components of the formula need to be adjusted, and I think most people would acknowledge that they do. That will raise a second question, which is, once you've adjusted those components, does the amount that each district is required to spend increase or decrease? Odds are that in some districts it will be an increase, but a second question that I think a lot of people who are in favor of reviewing the formula might not necessarily appreciate is, so assuming that we review the formula and determine that some changes need to be made, and for some districts that may mean they need to spend more money, for some it may mean the same, for some it may mean slightly less, particularly if their enrollment is declining. But then the second part of the formula is the portion that determines how much of what's called the foundation budget the district picks up and how much the state picks up. And I think that some of the people who are advocating for a, quote, adequacy study and a revision of the foundation formula assume that any increase will be borne by the state. There are very few districts where the overwhelming majority of the education is paid for by the state.
Right.
Extremely few.
Right.
So I would say in most districts, if the foundation formula is changed and the result is that districts are going to be required to spend more money on a per student basis, while the state portion may increase, the local portion is probably going to increase also. So I think people need to be conscious of that aspect of it.
Right, that's fascinating. Thank you for that. The Joint Committee on Education has been working so hard this term and had so many meetings. What are hearings, I should say. What are some of the bills that are coming through the committee that you think would be most interesting to the people in Bedford and Burlington?
Well, most of the bills that come through the Education Committee, I'm not sure are of huge interest to districts like yours or mine, because for the most part they're focusing on improving underperforming districts. And as you pointed out at the beginning, our districts don't fall into that category. The bills that the committee is spending the most time reviewing, and I anticipate reporting something out in the fall, will be bills dealing with some slight changes to the Education Reform Act of 2010 that is also known as, I think, an act to reduce the achievement gap, which is, I think we alluded to earlier, the fact that Massachusetts students are very high performing, but unfortunately we continue to see a significant gap between our lowest performing students and our highest performing students. All of our students' performance has improved over the past 20 years, but that gap has not narrowed very much, and that's where we're really focusing most of our attention. So, and the legislation tends to look at districts, low-performing districts versus individual students. One thing to keep in mind with respect to closing the achievement gap is, while it's most pronounced when you compare low-performing districts to high-performing districts, within each district it is still an issue. So I think that it's often overlooked in our communities, but in most school districts, and I know that it is true in mine, there remains a gap between the lowest achieving students and the highest achieving. And we're examining what kinds of programs are best at closing that gap and how to ensure that we make available to all students the tools that are necessary to allow them to perform well in school. So I think you'll see some legislation coming out relating to that. One piece of legislation that may be of interest to your district has to do with something called Healthy Youth, wanting to make sure that all public schools, if they are offering courses in health, which includes a wide range of things, including things such as healthy nutrition and exercise and so on, that they're based on the standards that the state puts out and are scientifically based and are not based on anecdote and things of that nature. So that's a bill that we're looking at. There are always bills that we alluded to already to the finance side on the looking at the review of the Chapter 70. I'm not sure that how far that bill will actually go. And then we have a wide range of bills that I think we've got 300 bills in the committee. Somewhere around 30 got reported out last session out of committee of the similar number that were filed. Somewhere a little between, I think, around 15 actually were enacted. So the number of laws that will change relative to education each 2-year session is relatively small. We even with that small number, we do get pushback, as you earlier indicated, from districts that are feeling that we're asking them to do a little bit too much. So I think this session we're trying to focus on just a few things, and again, refining the 2010 statute, looking to make sure that all our students receive adequate education in how to lead healthy lives, and a few curriculum bills, but I don't expect those to move.
Yeah, what interests me about the Healthy Youth Bill, which you may recall I testified before a committee about,
Yes.
is that we're talking about information. We're talking about providing scientific information to students. What students do with that information later may be a matter that they discuss with their family, but where we focus on what information do we provide to students as a school system, I think that's the important focus of things.
I think absolutely, and I think that's what the sponsors of the bill intended. I think that one thing that your listeners or your viewers might be interested in is last session we actually passed quite a number of education-related bills, some of which we have made reference to, but not all. And I think a few of them are of general interest. One that I'm particularly happy that we were able to enact is one relating to student discipline. You may or may not be aware of the fact that in Massachusetts, currently, if a student is expelled from a public school, there is no obligation for the district to provide any services for that student. So if you have a student who's expelled at, say, the age of 14 or 15, unless his or her family has resources to send them to a private school, that student has no educational options. And given the need for an educated workforce, you're basically condemning that student to a life of that has virtually no productivity.
Right.
And Massachusetts is in a minority in not providing services for students that are expelled. So starting in the fall of 2014, that academic year, schools will be districts will be required to provide some services for students on long-term suspensions and expulsions. It's actually not an awful lot of students. I know that there's a little bit of concern that this is a, quote, unfunded mandate, but our research shows that we're only talking about maybe 150 to 200 students across the Commonwealth, so it's not a huge number. And secondly, we're not saying that you have to pay tuition for the student to attend a different school. An online course might be an acceptable alternative, which leads me to another new law that we passed last session related to virtual education, which is something that we're going to be seeing more and more of. And the legislature was concerned that if we didn't have any standards for virtual/online education, that some students could be taken advantage of, and their families, for lack of a better word, by having their education be not meet the standards that we expect. We had one experience with one school where the only virtual school that existed in Massachusetts, it wasn't subject to any kind of real statewide oversight, and the performance of the students on the MCAS was not good. So that raised some questions, and we still leave it to districts to decide what they want to do, but within certain parameters. I actually think that there's huge opportunity going forward for something that's referred to as blended education. So the statute deals with an online school, which is where the students receiving the majority of their education online. I don't expect that there are going to be many students who go that route, but I do think that many, many schools, and it started already, are utilizing technology to help deliver, under the supervision of the classroom teacher, a better curriculum to students, more differentiated instruction, so that students who learn in different ways are able to access the curriculum. So I think that's the wave of the future, and we're keeping an eye on that.
Some of the feedback I've heard about the virtual schools is it the case that the districts are helping or are funding the education for the virtual schools? Does that come from the towns, in essence?
Well, virtual education would be like any other form of curriculum that's delivered by the district, in that depending upon how the district is funded, it would be funded in the same way. So if you have if you're accessing say an AP Latin course,
right,
not a lot of students might want to take that. So most districts couldn't afford to hire a teacher to teach 2 or 3 students, if that. But at a much lower and reduced cost, they could access an online course in that subject that the students could access, and the Latin teacher, for the majority of students who are taking Latin at the lower levels, would be able to provide some oversight, and that would be paid for by the districts. There is another option that is the complete virtual school, and the way that the law has set that system up, which has been in effect for the last just about a year, and the application process is going on now, is that providers would have to apply to the state for approval to open a virtual school, and there's an option. We require that they be nonprofit, and there's an option that school districts could come together and offer a virtual school for students in a number of different districts, some sort of on the idea of a collaborative approach. And in that instance, again, in the same way that collaborative programs are paid for by the districts that belong to the collaborative and charge a fee to districts that do not, a virtual school that was offered by that kind of an effort would be funded in the same way.
Okay, I see from the clock on the wall that we've run out of time, and it's fascinating and interesting how this time flies. I hope you'll be maybe willing to come back again sometime and talk to us again about these very interesting topics. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. I'd be more than happy to come in, and I would also encourage any of your viewers who have any questions about this not to hesitate to contact the Education Committee. I know oftentimes people operate under misconceptions about things that they've only heard a small amount of information about, and if you have any questions or concerns, please do not hesitate to contact the committee. And thank you very much for having me, Ken.
Thank you, and the contact information has been shown on the screen as we've been speaking, so please use that. Thank you very much for tuning in to Rapping with the Rep. I'm Representative Ken Gordon. Thank you.